All right. Hi, my name is Paul Edison-Lahm, class of 83, although I graduated in 90. This is the second year in a row we haven't been able to be in person in front of the buildings. So last year we made a short video. It's about 4 minutes long, and I'm going to start by showing that video, and then I'm going to talk about the buildings. The choice of architecture can say a lot about an institution. So it's actually a little surprising that here at Reed College, with its focus on the humanities, you won't find a single classical column or Roman arch. Instead, the buildings here are in a style called Collegiate Gothic. Triangular false gables, low-slung Tudor arches, and castle-like crenellations. So why this choice of medieval and Elizabethan styles for buildings built at the beginning of the 20th century, here in a former cow pasture in the middle of the Portland Basin? There are at least two ways to tell the story of this college, which owes its founding to Oregon settlers Simeon and Amanda Reed and the land which proved so hospitable to them. The Portland Basin, where they made their home and fortune, had previously been filled by three catastrophic floods from the east, each of which followed the path of the Columbia River. One of fire, the Columbia River basalts, 16 million years ago, a river of lava which flowed through the Cascades to the sea, leaving the tremendous basalts of our magnificent Columbia Gorge. One of rock and ice, the Great Ice Age floods, floods which poured through the Cascades of the Columbia Gorge, flooding the entire Willamette Valley and Portland Basin to a height of 400 feet, as witnessed by the Kalapuya people as recently as 12,000 years ago, and leaving the massive sand and gravel deposits that the college rests securely on today. And finally, one of Euro-American settlers in the 19th century, who again poured through the Columbia Gorge, aided in good part by Simeon Reed and partner William Ladd's efficient monopolization of the Oregon Steam and Navigation Company, which is how the Reed fortune was made. One of those settlers was the Unitarian minister and progressive reformer Thomas Lamb Eliot, who, with the aid of the Unitarian Ladies Sewing Society, helped found the Boys and Girls Aid Society, the Ladies Relief Society, the Library Humane Society, Parks Commission, and Art Museum. Eliot influenced the Reeds, especially Amanda Reed, to bequest much of the Reed fortune for an institution of learning for the promotion of practical knowledge, literature, science, and art. The land for the college had been, for at least the 12,000 years since the last of the Ice Age floods, within the traditional lands of the Clackamas-Qualiwalla people, one of the over 30 tribes that were forcibly marched by the U.S. government to reservation, which was further chipped away at and then terminated, and finally restored in 1983 as the sovereign Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Back in 1850, in order to further extinguish Native American title, the United States passed the Donation Land Claims Act, assigning plots of up to 1 square mile to white men and their wives, plots which were bought up cheaply by the enterprising Ladd, also a banker and real estate developer. The Ladd Estate Company donated the initial 40 acres of pasture land to the Reed Institute, in part because of the historic connection between the two men, and in part to burnish the prestige of its racially segregated suburb Eastmoreland to the south, purporting to protect Reed from being surrounded by low-class dwellings. Eliot chose Reed's first president, the young and idealistic progressive William T. Foster, who wanted to break from confining Ivy League traditions that emphasized sports and fraternities, and had a sweeping agenda that included confronting social ills such as high medical costs and false medical advertising, the conspiracy of silence in matters of sex, silly motion pictures, injustice to the unemployed, billboards on the Columbia River Highway, intercollegiate athletics, and the chaos and waste of English spelling. In the very mortar of the college, in this distinctive wide-jointed brickwork, you can find the geological evidence of the two great floods of basalt and gravel, and in the architecture, in this beautiful Tudor Revival detailing and hand-carved limestone, the contradictions of history. I hope you'll come back for the completion of this video, when we'll look more closely at some of the fantastic architectural details and also some unexpected history of these somewhat problematic, complicated, and, to me, beautiful and inspiring buildings. Could everyone hear that, and could everyone hear me now? All right. So the architecture tour has been going on for about 5 years with the help of especially Gay Walker in the Reed Archives and Mike Teskey, formerly of the Alumni Office and Director of Physical Plant, Townie Angel. But especially this man, Eric Wheeler, who runs Positively Portland walking tours. I recommend these walking tours of historical architectural walking tours of Portland. When his first tour, we were walking across campus and we were admiring the Hauser Library, this castle-like building, and he said, that's a Pietro Belluschi building. Now, Belluschi, if you don't live in Portland or you don't know, he's our preeminent modernist architect here. We're very proud of Belluschi. He designed the Portland Art Museum. He designed the Equitable Building, which is the first in the country entirely aluminum-clad, sealed HVAC system building built after World War II. And so it was a little hard for me initially to reconcile the man who, with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, the architects, designed this building, Big Pink, with a man who put these medieval hand-carved limestone grotesques around the Hauser wing of the library. So I'm going to just go over this quickly in sort of 4 stages, the buildings, 4 different shapes: Collegiate Gothic, Modernism, Postmodernism, and then whatever period we're in now, starting with this concept of the Collegiate Gothic. What is Gothic? According to Woodrow Wilson, when he was president of Princeton University, he said that the Collegiate Gothic there added 1,000 years to the history of the university and pointed every man's imagination to the earliest era of learning in the English-speaking race. So most likely Foster and Eliot would have chosen the Collegiate Gothic style, at least for that purpose, to suggest this connection with history. And Eliot in particular was an Anglophile. And I'll leave it for a little bit later in the presentation to unpack what English-speaking race might mean for these men. Gothic, we think of as Chartres or Notre Dame, this sort of the verticality, the flying buttresses or ornate tracery of rose windows, but especially that pointy arch, that two-sided arch, or the it's two compass arches put together. But that's not what we have here at Reed College. We've got something else entirely, something much more, in some ways, much more sedate. We have Tudor, which is an Elizabethan style, more of the 16th century. So that triangle we see everywhere in the false gables. They're false because gables are meant to hold up a roof line, but these are more of a false front. So you see that very familiar style, the triangle with the 2 little bump outs, the Corby stops or crow stops on the side. You'll see that pattern again and again repeated in the postmodern architecture. We also have, notably, the Tudor arch, which is a 4-centered arch. It's a wider, broader arch. Once you see that, you see it everywhere in all of the windows and all of the decor and styling as well. And finally, the crenellations at the top. These would have been defensive battlements at the time in the Elizabethan times. You would have had to have special dispensation from the sovereign to put them on your buildings because kings and queens were kind of nervous about lords having their own private armies. Even in Elizabethan times, these would have been mostly ornamental. So Foster and Eliot chose A.E. Doyle, a prominent rising architect in the early 20th century, who'd worked in many other styles. That's the Central Library in the sort of Beaux-Arts style, the bottom right, and then the Myron Frank building. And Doyle chose this, what Townie Angel calls the fundamental texture of the college, which is this brick and mortar and limestone. Now I know all colleges have brick, but ours is special. I will tell you why. What's his name? I'm going to confess at this point, I had a terrible migraine this morning, so my brain is glitching just a little bit, but we'll get through it. So the architect's name is Doyle, and he chose, first of all, this English bond, which is a combination of stretchers and headers, which gives a nice variegated quality to this, and the color of the brick is a nicely variegated chosen brick, and you'll see that repeated. Plus we have distinctively these wide joints. So they're about 7/8 inch wide, And they're so wide that they have to be filled with gravel, which I make a big point of in the video. It connects the basalts to the Columbia River basalts and the quartzites to the Missoula floods. But in any event, the mortar is then raked back to create that nice groove. And that creates that lovely texture, that lovely unevenness that, combined with the solidness of the limestone, this Salem limestone, which dates back to a period when the United States was covered in a warm tropical sea back in the Mississippian age, gives a very lovely texture of the alternating brick and limestone, all of which the limestone was hand carved. So all of this sort of foliate ornament, and they have the trifoil there in the middle, those ledges, all of that was carved by mostly Italian immigrant stonemasons who were working in a shed right outside of Eliot Hall, or the administration building as it was going to be called then. They brought a spur up from the Union Pacific tracks, and they brought those chunks of limestone that had been quarried back in Indiana, and they carved them by hand right here, or right there. I'm not on campus. I still have this feeling like you're all sort of on campus somewhere. So in any event, these buildings would like you to think they're made of stone. And so some of the details, like these coins on the corner, Quoins, would be appropriate in a stone wall or a stone building to hold the corners together. But in fact, Eliot and Old Dornblock, both ahead of their time, are reinforced concrete. If you want a building that's authentic, that says exactly what it is, look no further than McNaughton. That is a building, that's modernism. That's the rectangle. That is a building that's horizontal. It's slabs of concrete, aluminum panels, glass, maybe a little brick thrown in, but McNaughton is exactly what McNaughton says it is, and you can quote me on that. For the dormitories, Foster and Eliot chose to base a plan on Princeton and UPenn. And there's an argument that there's some quality in the dormitories that reflect the individual, autonomous, creative life of the student. And I think you can find that, but you can also find some other elements which suggest something different. This is, for those of you who may have played Tomb Raider in the 1990s, this is the manor of Lara Croft, the action hero in that video game, and this is her English manor where she practices her jumps and rolls. And there's an interesting gate there right on the front, of which I've only been able to find 3 examples. And this is the other one. This was a discovery. This was a clue we discovered, or Gay Walker discovered in the library. It's a postcard sent to President Foster from Compton Winnietts, an English manor of Elizabethan age dedicated to Henry VIII outside Stratford-upon-Avon. And there you see the gate at Compton Winnietts is a virtual, I should say, our Sallyport gate is a virtual copy of the gate at Compton Winnietts. The false gable, the crenellations, of course, the sundial, the triple window, the diapering, the cross-hatching of the brick, and of course the Tudor arch. But instead of the griffin of Henry VIII, to which the building at Compton Winnietts was dedicated, and the portcullis of the Tudors and the roses of Catherine of Aragon, instead we have the griffin of Nouveau Riche Simeon Reed, and the griffin again, and the griffin again. So I guess all colleges have this sort of tension built into them. There's the progressive or liberal ideals on the one hand, and then there's where the money comes from. And this is certainly a monument to a sort of the Portland aristocracy. That was a little harder than I thought it was going to be. This is all beautiful hand-carved limestone. Moving to Eliot Hall. Eliot Hall is based, as you can see, to a large extent on the work at St. John's College in Oxford. It is pronounced St. John's, I looked it up. And Reverend Eliot in particular, was a sort of an Anglophile. Foster wanted to distinguish Reed from all of the East Coast Ivy League schools. And nevertheless, all around the building, we have the shields of the Ivy League colleges. So right there in the front of over the front door, we have Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Penn, and Columbia. The only Gothic arches in that early construction, all of which was built in 1912 between January and September 1912, the only Gothic arch is here, as you might expect, the entrance to the chapel. To the extent that Gothic represents Northern Europe and Christendom, this is appropriate. You see the sort of nested Gothic arches that you might find at Chartres, and those octagonal Gothic, skinny Gothic columns. Foster and Eliot had a view of religion as being central in the life, in student life, but a non-sectarian approach. So if you, in the chapel, which has these deep medieval features, including this really dark and lovely hammer beam ceiling, but you will be hard pressed to find any Christian symbolism in the chapel. In fact, I would welcome anyone who has a better sense of the history or art history to see if you can find references to Christendom that I've not been able to discover. So Doyle dies prematurely in 1928 of Bright's disease, and he leaves at the head of the firm Pietro Belluschi, who was much younger than when this photo was taken. But Belluschi is starting to work in a modernist idiom, and so he's working on some buildings downtown for Doyle at this time. Here's a brass door from the Pacific Power Building. That's an Art Deco testament to the first electric transmission line from Willamette Falls, the first in the country. He's about to start work on the Portland Art Museum. This building was such a dramatic break from the earlier classical or Beaux-Arts traditions of the museums and buildings in Portland that the city fathers were going to said no, and Belluschi reached out to Frank Lloyd Wright, and Frank Lloyd Wright wrote a letter to the city fathers saying, look, come into the 20th century. So this got built in, I think, 1934. But back in 1930, Belluschi has on the drawing board this lovely building, the Hauser Library, which had been designed by Doyle working with Reed. And according to historian Dorothy Johansson, he hated it. I mean, you can kind of imagine and these are the clustered octagonal Gothic columns, and you've got this, these arched ceilings and so forth, vaulted ceilings. How retrograde and bourgeois this decor must have seemed to Belluschi. I love this building. Even before, now it's been reconditioned and it has a more museum-like feel than it did when there were dogs and smokers milling around in that lobby. But it is kind of a secular cathedral, which appeals to my taste, and even has sort of these pendants that suggest, there might be flying buttresses coming out from the side of the building. This is Tony Belluschi, who is Pietro's son, and we took a tour with him to Pietro Belluschi's Zion Lutheran Church. Oh, the text make it looks like it's Tony's, but Pietro designed this, and you can see he went forward with that Gothic idiom in sort of a modernist version of the Gothic Arch. This is a completely lovely space if you're in Southwest Portland in Goose Hollow area. This is a beautiful, he designed many beautiful cathedrals, or chapels, I should say. So Belluschi takes us over into the period of modernism, the rectangle. And the first example of this, and this is a poor example, but Belluschi was the designer of the Bagley Downs housing project in Vancouver during World War II. So this was temporary housing, and after the war it was bought on the cheap and trucked over to Reed to serve as variously the ceramics building and the bookstore and the faculty office building, some of you may remember, which has been successively truncated time and time again, and is now, it remains this sort of rump of the building as the gray wood building, tongue firmly in cheek because it's made of gray wood. The first real example of modernism at Reed is the chemistry building. It's the end of World War II, nuclear age, focus on the sciences. Reed planned for this really big science center that would incorporate physics and biology and chemistry. Only had enough money to build the chemistry building, which is now the psychology building. this is except for the brick, it's a complete break from any of the previous architecture. To me, it looks like any elementary school, anywhere in the United States of mid-century. It has some features that will get picked up on later. It uses the slope toward the canyon in a slightly more interesting way, and it's been redone now that it's a psychology building, so it has some lovely skylights. If you remember, it used to be a dark, smelly building, all those chemicals. Now it has a lovely lobby that looks out into the canyon. So Belluschi goes on to work with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. He designs the Pan Am building in New York, which is now the MetLife building. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill are the preeminent modernist international style architects in the 20th century and perhaps into current. On the right there, you see the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building. In the 1950s, we got from Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill with Belluschi at the helm, Foster Schultz McNaughton. These much unloved buildings are certainly modernism, and they were also built on the cheap. I don't have a lot to say about them now, although I want to return to the Foster Schultz social room because I think it's important. But Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill goes on to design the science building. So this is biology, and it was built originally with those panels are enamel copper, blue enameled sheet metal. And so they heated up. They were terrible. And also, this building has no relationship architecturally to any of the other buildings. They came back in the 1960s and they addressed the issue of the sunshades. They put something that was more sort of appropriate to the original copper that you see in other parts of the campus. And they built these neo-Gothic, you can call them because they're vertical, these neo-Gothic pillars on the outside with the nice variegated brick to tie in with the rest of the campus. Those are also functional pillars because they're hollow and they serve as ventilation for the vent hoods in physics and biology. So a few years ago, we were doing the tour and we brought DocoMomo, the Society for the Documentation and Conservation of Modern Architecture, to campus. And guess which one of the buildings they found they loved the best? Well, it was the Cross Canyon dormitories. These also somewhat unloved buildings, because I lived in one, and RIP Sisson Dormitory, which has now been replaced by Bragdon. But these buildings, the modernists found quite charming, and it's kind of changed my view of them a little bit. They were also built on the cheap, as much was at Reed until the Bragdon era. And they've been refurbished, and now they have double pane windows. And what I notice now with their inside is the extent to which the Cross Canyon dorms use the slope toward the canyon, and especially use the 2 or 3 story glass walls or glass windows looking out to the canyon as sort of a fourth wall. There you have this sort of curtain of trees. And if nothing else, they remind us, some of us fondly, of the mid-century ranch homes we grew up with. They were designed by, this is the first Reed architect, I guess the only Reed architect who is in our pantheon here, Neil Farnham, class of 40, designed these, and they were built in the late 50s and 60s. So Farnham is going to take us over to the period of postmodernism. The triangle is back. What is postmodernism? Well, I'm going to just gloss over that pretty quickly because that's a conversation in this group that I think could probably take several days. So starting with the Centre Pompidou in France, a little arbitrarily, but I want to point out its playfulness, its use of color, the fact that it puts the services, the HVAC tubes, pipes, whatever they are, on the outside of the building. But postmodernism really came to Portland, many of us remember, with the Michael Graves Portland building that has this playful quotation of classical ornament and use of color and so forth. And it comes to Reed, perhaps with Farnham's Volume Center in 1979. Well, let's stretch this a little bit. There is this playful use of color, certainly, and those pipes in front, if you can see them, are not actual services, but there are other places in which where the HVAC is visible and painted and up front. There's a much more playful use of, look at that Clarendon font, that extended Clarendon font running up the side of and in color, no less. This building has in common a variegated brick of sort of blue and red, which is some people find attractive. But again, it also uses this, the window into Cross Canyon is really a stunning vista. And that's picked up again in the current chemistry building and some other buildings that have gone in since. The real onslaught of postmodern comes from Zimmer Gunsel Frasca architects, which are now sort of the house architects for Reed. And the triangle is back. The false gable is back with its Corby stops. And that was first seen in the new wing of the library, which was built in 1989, and then again added to in the 90s. So here you see there's this combination of these Tudor designs and then modern as well. You can see when you combine the two, when you look at the ends of the two, the Hauser wing and the new Zimmer Gunsel Frasca wing, they have quoted very directly that false gable with the Corby stops in the buildings. Now, I imagine if I grew up in the UK, right, I imagine they have these things on, on every street corner, that this would seem like a tacky American ripoff to me. But growing up as I did in the San Fernando Valley, I am impressed by the weight of history here. Although the extent to which the postmodern version works for me aesthetically, I think largely based on the materials. Where they've used the variegated brick with the wide joints, really nice. Where they've used copper dormers, for example, also very nice. Some of the decor, but the replacement of colored concrete for the limestone doesn't work as well. It doesn't catch the light as brightly, and it tends to stain. But they've done some really nice work in some of the detailing. This is, many of us would remember, is the old entrance, and they've redone it in limestone. It's a beautiful little sitting area. The best, I think, is the atrium in the interior, where they've used the exterior of the old Hauser wing as the interior of this very sunlit atrium, and they've relocated the grotesques at the top. I think one of them is racist, but I'm not positive. So contemporary modernism, postmodernism, or maybe green or sustainable modernism. I'm not sure what to call this. It's the box again, but it's got angles. So our two examples of this are, first of all, the Performing Arts Building, which is finally Reed is putting performing arts on its front door and bringing together music and dance and theater, which had been scattered to the four winds on campus, here in one beautiful building. This, I guess, green or sustainable modernism might be the best term for this. The architects here are Opsis, working with Fisher Dax. It has a bioswale and eco roof that's watered from on-site rainwater, and automatic louvered climate control windows and heating and cooling coils in the polished raw concrete floors. Sustainable wood acoustic walls, including wood from a beloved fallen tree, and a 6-degree curve to the southern exposure to take advantage of seasonal light. It's a beautiful building, and importantly, it looks out to Portland in a way that previous buildings looked inward, looked toward that central quad. And that's, I think, more than a metaphor, because this building really does, in terms of being ADA and parking accessible, it does present a welcome mat to Portland in a way that previously Reed had kind of turned internally. Finally, we have, that's another view of the Performing Arts Building. It is an interesting building to walk into. Acoustically, there's because of that acoustic wall, and Emma, you might have more to say about this as far as whether it's comfortable to be in it, because it immediately feels like you can whisper and be heard on the other side of the room. But many people I talk to love to study in it, so it's a beautiful, beautiful atrium. Finally, we've got Trillium Dorm, which is it's finished just 2 years ago, I guess. And it's actually had students in it for a year and a half, I guess. It is Platinum LEED certified. How does it tie in with previous architecture? The copper panels, maybe, and also the use of this very subtle, variegated, one-sided Roman brick. And now you're saying, well, I thought all bricks had 6 sides. Well, yeah, that's true, but usually you can put them in either direction, forward or back. Now, these only have one face that faces out, So it was actually so complex that they went through one set of bricklayers to get these done correctly. And the photo doesn't really capture it here. The extent of the variations in the brick is very subtle, and it's interesting to see it in different lights. And I've only started to kind of get down there and take pictures of it. So that is more or less our progression of different styles. I said I would talk a little bit about the Foster Social Room, which I have gone on record as saying should logically be the intellectual center and heart of the college, because it represents the intersection of Foster's idea of the engaged intellectual, politically engaged intellectual, and Scholz's idea of more of the focused on the life of the mind, humanities. I've been told that that's kind of a silly notion, but I keep saying it. One of the people who's helped me the most with this is John Sheehy, author of the thickest book I've ever read, I think, Comrades of the Quest, which, despite being this thick, is an oral history. And so it's very readable, and I would really recommend it. It's available in the Read Bookstore or online. John sent me an email after seeing my video last summer, and he said, it's interesting you mentioned this connection to Woodrow Wilson, because Foster, like Wilson, was a eugenicist. In fact, he was head of the Oregon Social Hygiene Society while he was president. He wrote a book called The Social Emergency with other authors, some of whom were Reed profs, and they are obsessed with sex. Now, I want to get to the racial and class dimensions of eugenics in a moment. Actually, that goes beyond my expertise, and I've only kind of just verged into this, so I'm going to kind of do the best I can with it, but a lot of this is pretty preliminary. Their concern seems to be mostly the predominant sexualization in the culture in the early 20th century. All of these movies and four-color advertisements and so on. And it's interesting because they don't have the language of sex that we know, the sort of modern language of sex from sexologists like Magnus Hirschfeld or Freud or feminism. So they feel like youth really need to know about sex, but they need to be taught by the right people and in a way that doesn't arouse them, because that's a real concern here. There's a deeper concern with the spread of venereal disease, and Foster seems to have a particular concern about young men who contract VD and then are treated by quack doctors. There are some feminist notes, perhaps, about the concern about, was a more protectionist kind of view, but concern about the treatment of women. So I think it's worth reading and worth looking at and thinking about Reed's history in that context. A bigger concern is that this organization was probably one of many, or maybe even the preeminent organization that lobbied for the sterilization bills that eventually passed around this time in the Oregon legislature and were signed by the governor. These resulted tragically in the involuntarily sterilization of several thousand Oregon inmates and patients in mental hospitals over the next 6 decades. Interestingly, they were opposed by the anti-vax groups at the time, who have a historic concern with the liberty of the body from state intervention. But the laws did pass. They were ruled unconstitutional in the Skinner case in 1942, but continued in Oregon until 1981, I've recently discovered. So the likelihood that the Oregon Social Hygiene Society supported these is very great. I have not been able to get back into the Reed archives in the past year. Even though the campus is open now, the archives are still closed. And Oregon Historical Society likewise has been closed. So the answer to this question, and I fear it's yes, I would be really happy to learn that no, Foster opposed these sterilization bills, but it seems unlikely. The answer is to be found in box 138 in the Reed archives, which has the bulletin of the Social Hygiene Society. This is bigger work, and some of us are talking about how Reed might address this history. I think there's a student thesis here. Simon Woodside has already, class of 2010, has already done some preliminary work on this that shows that there was, for example, some Reed profs who brought some Nazi eugenic propaganda to campus in the 1930s. There's more work to be done here. In the meantime, I raise a question in the video, and I kind of don't ever really totally answer it, but One thing that John and I've got some insight into is how this might tie into the organization of the campus. As many of you know, Eliot and Old Dorn Block were originally thought of as only being one leg of a four-sided quad. The initial idea was that Reed would be a university. And one of the purposes of the quad, if one goes back to Oxford and Cambridge, is to separate town from gown. It's to keep your students away from the townies. And so the concern about student sexuality may be baked, however unsuccessfully, into this attempt to constrain student life with a quad, and of course of which only one segment was built. If you're interested in this, one of the best buildings is the History of Reed College Campus and its Buildings by Richard Ritz, 1990, and online, the Heritage Master Plan of Reed that Gay Walker and Professor Charles Rhine and Townie Angel and Mike Teskey contributed to. So I will stop there and look and see if there are any questions. Thank you.